Welcome, everybody. Good morning, and welcome to the first of EMPA's webinar series for 2024. I'd like to start this welcome by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and the Indigenous people of New Zealand as well, and their connections to the land, sea, and community. And we pay our respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. In particular, today, I want to pay respect to the lessons they have to teach us about connection to the environment and being storytellers and teaching through story. And my name's Rebecca Riggs. I'm an EMPA Fellow, and on behalf of EMPA, I welcome everybody here today. We have close to 400 registrations for this webinar, and so we're looking for a strong, opinionated discussion from panelists and audience. So today's webinar is incredibly close to my heart. It's about EMPA's principle number 2, strategic messaging, connection, and credibility. Effective disaster communication requires a rigorous strategic process. We must do more, far more, than transmit accurate data. We must understand why we speak. We must understand those we are speaking with. We must listen to ensure that we've been heard, understood, and believed. And we're joined today by two amazing panelists. Isaia Piho, who is the Pau Whakahaidia of, which is the National Manager, Maori, for Fire and Emergency New Zealand. He manages a team of people that work with the Indigenous peoples of New Zealand before, during, and after an emergency. He also provides guidance to Fire and Emergency New Zealand around incorporating Maori language and perspectives into the way they work. Isaia joined the emergency space as a firefighter back in 2009 and has attended a number of significant events during his 14-year career with Fire and Emergency New Zealand. He's also worked in areas focusing on community engagement, risk reduction, and community education. For Isaia, it is about helping people and giving back to the community that drives him every day. I'd also love you to welcome Renea Hanvin. She is the CEO and founder of Resilient Ready, a certified social enterprise driving a new ecosystem in business and community risk reduction and resilience. Her focus is to strengthen community networks and global well-being in this new era of disasters. Renea released a white paper on business community connections in the Blue Mountains and designed a business community resilience toolkit for fire-impacted communities, and is co-designing a business climate adaptation tool with the Kangaroo Island community, just to name a few of the projects that Renea has worked on. She's committed to saving lives and livelihoods. Renea delivers fast-forward disaster resilience and preparedness solutions. So welcome to you both. I'm very excited to have this conversation. Be as opinionated as you want, and that applies to everybody else here. You know, articulate opinions are what drive us to new thoughts and new ways of doing things. So welcome, everybody. Welcome, Isaia and Renea.
Sure.
So let me just change a few pieces of paper around in front of me. My first question to you both. We talk about strategic communicating, and often it's on the name of documents, and often it's on the name of teams. But what does it really mean, and how do we know if we're really being strategic and really managing to communicate in ways that make a difference? Whichever one of you wants to go first. Renea wants to go first.
Thanks, Isaia. A big hug to you. So thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, it's great to be part of this conversation. And I have to say, I am known for doing disasters differently. So opinionated, if you ask me to be, absolutely happily to oblige. So I think in the space of disaster preparedness, response and recovery and resilience, the way we communicate and speak has really evolved over the past sort of 10, 15 years that I've been in this space. But I think, as you allude to, strategic communication, like, what is that? I mean, you know, we have it, we see it everywhere, and in the process of writing, communication engagement plans for communities and for councils and government. So it's a bit of a tick the box kind of to do, I guess, at the moment. But what really is it? And to me, I think the biggest evolution that's happened is that we've evolved from just words being put on paper or put into emails or put into social media for the purpose of just putting words out, to actually having words going out that resonate with the audiences much more than they used to be, and that actually drove outcomes. So the biggest, I guess, challenge that I find in the space, and I collaborate with and consult to councils and governments and academia, but I'm not a government person or a council person or an academia person. I wouldn't last a day, I don't think. Is that a lot of them, like information that comes out, it's very focused on what emergency services want to say or what government wants to say. And that's very interesting for the people working in government and emergency services. But from my side of the fence, being, someone from business communities and small businesses and that real grassroots community space, I don't get it. I don't understand it. It doesn't mean anything to me. So I think the biggest opportunity, and absolutely the start of the evolution that I've seen in the space, is that the messaging is having more relevance and more consideration to the recipient and what it wants the recipient to know and what it wants the recipient to do. So I think, from my perspective, there's been some great progression in what strategic communications is and the fundamental role that it plays in the emergency management space. But I think it's just the start of some really great, opportunities to continue progressing. Yeah, Isaia, what about you?
I think it's the start too. What, Isaia, in New Zealand, how do you think strategic communication is defined, and how is it lived up to?
Tuatahi ake mihi atu ana ki a koe, Rebecca, nā ui whaariki mai ngā kōrero e pāna ki te tokorua nei. I just really want to acknowledge you for laying out the introduction for me and Renee today. And nei rā te mihi ki a rātou ko wehe atu ki te pō. Rātou ki a rātou, haere tātou ki a tātou, tēnā tātou. Just take the time to acknowledge those that have passed. In Māori, communication is important, and we always take the time to acknowledge those of our loved ones or those that have passed. And I know recently there has been loss, so just really want to take the time to reflect on that before coming back to us, the living. I was saying to Rebecca before this webinar, I have a real love-hate relationship with the word strategic, and it's probably not a good start for speaking about a principle on strategic communication, but it's not necessarily what I think the principle embodies, but more around how that word strategic is used. You put it on in front of anything, and apparently it adds this extra layer of, I'm not too sure, substance, but for me sometimes it's an element of shallowness. For me, when I think of strategic communication, I think of it more as thoughtful, something that is thoughtful. And Renee hit the nail on the head when she was talking about instead of just thinking about what we say, thinking about how it's received at the other end. Who is receiving what you wanting to say, and do they connect with it? Do they trust it? If I think about the next part of the principle, connection and credibility, I think of it connection and trust. So really trying to build in the values of those that you're trying to communicate into what you're trying to say. So focusing on the things that drive and motivate them to reach them, as opposed to just throwing out messages that you think are right without taking into consideration the people that are listening. And when you're introducing, when you're talking about the welcome, acknowledging traditional custodians, you sort of talked about it in there around storytelling. Storytelling for me is what it looks like in our context, in the New Zealand context. But I don't speak for all of New Zealand. I'm just one person. But yeah, that's pretty much me. I just think, yeah, being more thoughtful about what you're trying to say, being more thoughtful around who you're trying to connect with, being more thoughtful as what resonates with them, and from there you can build something that I believe is truly strategic.
And taking on both of your thoughts, I mean, it's something that takes time. It is a process in and of itself to be strategic or thoughtful or consider prior to speaking. And it's encouraging organizations and ourselves in the rush of an emergency to actually take that time, and prior to an emergency too, to take that time so that we can be rigorous, to make that line in the sand. So let's tell some stories of times in which you've really seen that principle applied in your own organizations or elsewhere, or you've pushed to have it happen yourself, and what the consequences of that were.
I don't mind going.
Yes,
first.
you go first.
I can't keep the beauty about going second is I normally can just say I just agree with everything that Renee has said, but I don't mind going first this time. I
Awesome.
think if I go back to, if I could go back to what I was talking about communicating, I guess with the values of or connecting with the values of the people that are your audience. We've run a couple of campaigns, for example, around trying to really promote, in this case, fire safety within the household. In our context, in the New Zealand context, Māori are disproportionately impacted by or affected by unwanted fires, more so than any other ethnicities. Now, there's a number of contributing factors to that. However, for us, that's something that needs to change. Now, we can continue to push out the same messaging that we do for everybody, or really stop and think about what does connect with Māori, what does connect with what we call whānau Māori, our families. We could, and this is what it looks like, I guess, in practice. You need to do something or you will die. That's generally how I'm pretty sure how most of emergency management communications tend to work. But for Māori, actually, what is more effective, what resonates more with them, is actually do this for your family, do this for the well-being of your grandchildren, do this for the well-being of the next generations, and that actually connects more to what they believe in, intergenerational well-being, the well-being of their future, more so than if you don't do this, you will die. Or if you do this, you will die. So it's really about finding those aspects that connect to the values of the people that you're trying to talk to.
There's some amazing research into cardiac patients showing that do this and you will die is a really bad strategy, because that's a lot to think about. It's also very negative. And what they've found is the most powerful, this is from doctors, this is not corporate messaging, but from individual surgeons, cardiac surgeons, if they say, what is it you would do if you were healthy? And then they make a plan about that, and that has a statistical chance of making a change in people's lives, rather than saying, stop eating so much, stop drinking, blah, blah, blah. Otherwise you'll die. It just doesn't, sorry about that. That's very poor form. So yeah, I'm fascinated by that, and because you'd think with really great intentions that is the truth. Please listen to us. This is serious, but it's it takes a different way of speaking. Isaia, I've just been asked on the questions. Can you give us an example of some messaging that connects into the real concerns and values of the people in the audience community?
Yeah, so in that case, what we were doing, we were running a campaign around push the button to test your smoke alarm. This is a very specific example. It may save your life, but what we reshaped the message was press the button for the well-being of your family. And instead of the images being of a single person or a single hand pressing the button, we actually, because we are on a tight timeline and budget constraints, we used photos of myself and my kids, and actually my uncle who would pass off as my grandfather in the imagery. But I guess the nature of the imagery, like it's more there is aspects that you need to consider in terms of the wording, but there's also aspects that you need to consider in terms of the imagery that supports it. So being able to show 3 generations of people, for example, shows 1, a connection of family, but 2, also a intergenerational connection of knowledge being shared.
Somebody mentioned that they love the Have a Hum campaign in New Zealand, asking people to have a think about themselves, about others before they think about themselves. Do you want to just share that campaign?
I think that if I'm correct, that might be the ACC or the Accident Compensation ad. And the one that comes to my head is there is a person about to do what we call a manu, or for people that don't know what a manu is, it's when you stand on a platform and you jump into something and do a bomb and the water goes up, you jump into a body of water. In this case, it challenges the person who I think was actually of Māori descent to have a think, or have a think about what they were going to do, jump into an unknown body of water before doing it. And it brought up different images around what their life will be like, but more how their decisions impacted others. And that was one example. I've seen others, for example, particularly around the pandemic, where instead of just putting up ourselves as emergency workers, because I wear multiple hats. I do wear a Māori hat, but actually when I'm representing emergency services to others, I'm wearing an emergency service hat. But so using our community, using our people to stand up and deliver the message. But during the pandemic, for example, they asked people to to stay home for the safety of their people, their family, and stuff like that. So there's been plenty of examples now where they're starting to particularly tap into that way of communicating to reach into Māori.
Fantastic, thank you. Renee, what about you? Where have you seen the principle of targeted strategic messaging applied, and how has that worked? What changes has it made?
So coming second now, I can say I agree with everything Isaia said. So yes. No, and I think we're all saying, we're both saying the same thing. I think what is absolutely essential in the space of communications, and I love thoughtful communications and strategic communications, is it's less about us and it's so much about the recipient. So if I cast myself back to a few decades ago, when I did my PR degree, I remember a subject and we put hats on, like, who are you? And I think that is I don't know if it's a lost skill or if it's a re-evolving skill, but I think when you're creating strategic messaging, you've got to start with the person that you're creating it for, and what do they think? What do they feel? How are you going to earn their trust? How are they going to think differently and then potentially do something differently relating to your message? And dare I say, that changes for all types of people. So you can create, one message and go, well, that message is going to fit every community across the world. And it won't. Clearly it won't. So you've got to work out who are those really targeted groups within the groups of communities that you want to communicate with. And someone popped in the chat that there was a speaker at a DEMC conference, and I'm not sure if I'm referring to the right one, but when I think about most recent campaigns that have had fantastic messaging in a medium that is so right for the audience, I'm going to say her surname wrong, but Stephanie Rangi, who did the campaign about don't take drugs and cook. And she presented it at a conference last year, and it is one of the best programs I've ever seen. She self-identified it was either going to make or break her career because it was really challenging, you know, the kind of conversation. But if you were looking for a program and a messaging campaign that was on a really difficult topic that was, you know, directly connected to, because it included and it represented, and most importantly, it tested beforehand with the target audience. And I think when you're looking for, you know, strategic steps to take, don't just assume that you know what that audience is. And I'm going to be a bit controversial here. Don't just necessarily go to one of those data fact-finding places where they have all this survey data that's going to tell you what you think you want to hear. I have reference groups that I go to when I want core messaging to go out. So I have a small business reference group. I've got CEO reference groups. I've got high people in, you know, councils, like major people in government that I say, I want to reach out to these people like you. Can you tell me what you get from this messaging? I don't tell them what I'm trying to say. I say, can you tell me what you've taken from this messaging? And then if they tell me what I hope they've heard, awesome, I'm on the right track. But if they tell me a completely different component, I'm like, right, well, clearly I'm not actually translating what I want to say in the right way for them to understand it.
And that's about measuring the right thing, not recognition. Can I just put in? Because often we say, well, there's great recognition for this campaign, but that's not the same as they understand what we meant to say.
100%. And so many programs and tenders and projects come with outputs. You must do 25 social media posts and 1 website and, you know, 4 EDMs. Well, fine, I can do that. I could do that with my eyes closed. But is it going to make any difference and drive an outcome? And outputs, yes, fine. But outcomes is what we need to be driving and, you know, generating and, you know, trying to change and educate and, you know, drive behavior changes. So to me, it's what's the outcome that you want from your communications, which is the messaging. As Isaia said, it's absolutely the visuals. Like, I'm so visual. I see things before I read things. So if it looks weird, I'm gone. And a great example with that, and I don't want to throw anyone under the bus, but I did attend a government/emergency services day, and I listened to someone presenting their program, which was aimed at business people. And nothing, the words, the pictures, nothing resonated with me. So it talked about caravan parks, as in an owner of a caravan park. And I had beautiful pictures of caravans in the sun setting on a beach. But the person runs the caravan park. So I didn't connect with it because I was like, well, that's where I might go on holiday next week. But you're not talking to me as the caravan park owner, because it's not the words and the images are not. So I think there's a lot of wasted outputs that aren't delivering or driving an outcome.
And I'm just thinking of, you know, the fact that we have to communicate very quickly in a disaster and emergency in the response phase, but we can do all that analysis stuff before.
100%.
So we have a real sense of who we're speaking to. I can see in the chat that people are posting really good examples. And I think Simon mentioned the comms advice I repeat most is say what is, not what isn't, in terms of not telling people what not to do all the time. Thank you. I sense that we kind of all know. I've just been advised there are some specific questions over here. To both of you, do you think imagery works better for people who may not have a diverse language backgrounds? Do you have any evidence of that? I think you have to be so clear with imagery, though, as I often have difficulty understanding what road signs are really trying to say. So talk a little bit about your sense. We know that imagery is important, but what does it look like to get it right?
Yeah, so I mean, from my perspective, I'm very visual. So as I mentioned before, I'll see something before I read it. So a picture tells 1,000 words. I mean, we all know that, but it is near impossible to find the right picture to demonstrate a situation, and particularly in the space that we're in, where I'm very considerate and cautious around triggering everyone, So I don't want to put, you know, particular photos up when we're talking about disaster events and that, because I just don't want to do that. So I think finding the one right image is near impossible. But in this day of, you know, social media and MP4s and all sorts of things, I think the storytelling is where the imagery kind of comes into play. So we do a lot of socials, and, you know, they all have little videos and stuff, and some of them are so off the mark, but I'm really, I guess, you know, considerate in what imagery we include, but that there's the storytelling of images. So you don't just rely on, you know, one image necessarily like representing, you know, 10 things that you want to say.
Any thoughts, Isaiah, on that one?
Yeah,
Pictures versus language?
yeah. I mean, the common sense type things are obviously things that pop to the top of my mind around it. Pictures, much like communication, being relevant, and what Renee was saying around helping you tell the story. There's only so many words that you can use before people you know, start to switch off. So having images that support or not embellish, but, you know, help you tell that story is something that's really important. The thing though is, and for me, and I was going to bring it up in, a little bit later, is that, you know, a challenge for us is time, you know, and timeliness, I guess. You know, there is, you know, in a response, you've got, you know, a lot less time. The time windows are very compressed. So, you know, so as Renee was talking about, you know, it's about being very cautious. You know, going back to the concept around strategic communications, you know, strategic communication is really dependent on the amount of time that you have. You know, obviously doing the legwork in the pre-event space is really helpful, but as things start to evolve and shift, you know, so does the way that we need to think about, you know, how we communicate. So similar with you know, using images and stuff like that. You know, I'll just use the image that's behind me, for example. This is something that we developed to tell a story about our vision with working with Māori as tangata whenua. You know, we have time, and normally when I put this image up, I've got time to tell people about the different bits and bobs and how everything connects. But the reality is, when you're in an emergency, you know, it's got to be a lot more succinct and a lot more
I just
clear.
wanted to mention that Susie had already called out that she loved your backdrop. It tells the story. It's all about place, she said. So it does hit home to have those images. I also like, I mean, I was thinking as you were both speaking, we've got to layer, because different things will connect to different people in different ways. We're often quite obsessed with being consistent, which we need the facts to be as accurate as possible. But does this push to consistency sometimes limit the ways in which we could communicate to a wide and diverse audience?
Yeah, I agree, Rebecca. And I think, again, to me, it comes back to the recipient and what you want them to hear and know. And, you know, with different, you know, nationalities, different languages, different personal experiences, etc., I think you can't necessarily communicate every way for everyone, but I think there can be respectful and thoughtful communications that is inclusive of all the different types of recipients. And we've alluded to before that, you know, I mean, what is it? Preparation is better. I've forgotten the South Park quote, but we know that if you, that might be showing my age a bit, but, you know, if we're doing like scenario training and preparedness for how we're going to respond to fires, we need to do exactly the same thing to how we're going to share the communications messaging. And I think, you know, yes, we know disasters can go off on different kind of tangents, but I think we've all been in the industry long enough to know that they typically follow, you know, a process of timings and communications, et cetera, or we know the majority, 80% perhaps, of what might happen. So I've done in my former years, I was a crisis communications expert, so big corporates and whatnot. So I've written plans and, you know, who would be the spokesperson? What would they say? We train them to say it. What if this happens? How do they stand? What tie do they wear? What if they're not available? Like you can go through the whole warrant of, you know, how do you tell your staff? Do you tell your staff before you tell the community? Like, what's the process that I think is really fundamental, and a lot of organizations don't see the value of, but for ministers or for councillors or for, you know, anyone with a public profile as well, or a leader of a team, I think, you know, the media training is absolutely fundamental. And if I can jump in there too, things like when disasters occur and we have our media turning up, you know, with the cameras wanting, you know, I have a fantastic lived experience owner of a caravan park, or former owner of the caravan park in Kangaroo Island. And she was like, you know, they were waiting for her to cry. And she's like, I'm not going to cry. So you're turning up here waiting for me to cry. You need to go somewhere else. So I think, again, it's about understanding all the different ways of, you know, communicating situations and then planning for them in advance. So we deliver programs in communities that say, don't respond to the media if you don't want to. Contact your tourism association, or here's the process, or the council, so that we're helping to channel and help communities, you know, not then put themselves in a pickle and, you know, the front page of their business is, you know, saying the wrong thing, or it, you know, it results in no one coming to their town, or whatever it might be. So I think there's a lot of strategic work in preparedness for communications that can really have a big impact.
And especially that using that, you know, and working with that channel that is the media, because they will be there. So plan,
100%.
as you say, plan all the possibilities there, not just the key messages and the official spokesperson.
100%.
We've got quite a specific question to you guys about imagery. Your thoughts on cartoon type animation imagery versus real life images, thoughts, experiences, opinions.
We have a saying in Māori, horopaki, 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 which means context, 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 or situation, situation, situation.
Nice.
You know, we obviously, this is cartoon imagery, but that's for a specific purpose, a specific context, but it also can tell a pretty big story. But in an emergency situation, again, goes back to the who are you trying to connect with, what resonates with them. I just, yeah, the context is the driver as to whether it's relevant or not. You know, for some people they prefer they might prefer that method of communication. I try to simplify things, you know, in terms of you know, when it comes to things like this. You know, we've been talking about, you know, like people fronting communications, for example, and having the right person fronting it for the audience that you're trying to reach. And when I simplify it, you know, I think I put my father hat on and I think about my two kids, and there are times where I can't tell them to do anything, but a person of their similar age can tell them something of a similar nature, and it has that influence, it has that connection. To obviously my kids, I'm just an old crusty, so you know, it's really that. I guess in the cartoon space, or that cartoon question, that's if that is a means of communicating with people and people resonate with that, then I don't have an issue with it.
Yeah,
Renee,
I
anything
agree.
you'd like to
Yeah,
add
I
there?
agree. I think context is absolutely king, but I also have, I guess, considered, I have a lot of consideration around why I typically ask myself, why should we not use it? So if we have an image or something, and then again, I think just my risk and my crisis management kind of, the backing is like, and it's not necessarily like, would we offend anyone? Although that's obviously part of it. But again, I allude to the comment before around, you know, I don't ever want to trigger someone. So, you know, we have very considered imagery used, and sometimes, you know, animations is better than real life because you can reduce the kind of potential impacts, but other times, yeah, certainly real life is used. And a lot of the work that we do is let's be honest, like disaster preparedness, like, oh, like, you know, oh, have you checked your insurance lately? Woohoo. So we need to bring some, you know, Renee magic to it and, you know, liven it up a bit. So I don't go over the top, but we certainly do bring some kind of pizzazz to the conversation to get there, you know, to get kind of just a bit of cut through, I think.
Yeah, and I you know, I would concur. It goes back to what we were saying at the beginning, who are we trying to reach and what will reach them? And also, I guess, you know, rationally, what capacity do we have?
Right.
You know, do we have a gun photographer? Do we have a great animator? These things can make a difference, because we all have fewer resources than we'd want to have. I have another question from the group. What would you consider to be the number one thing that all emergency comms plans have to have, that you would expect to be the most useful when that emergency does occur? So we're talking about pre-planning. I've got about a list of 10.
Yeah.
You've got one.
One.
Yeah. You've got one. What do you, you know, what have you seen comms plans missing and gone, well, you're not going to get it right if you don't have that? How about that question?
So I would say archetypes of your audience. So I think, again, I think the whole kind of foundation of the conversation today is around who are you communicating to? What do they need to know? How are they going to receive the messaging? You know, and I think if you can, I love archetypes. It's like, you know, the types of people or business people or community people or government. Again, I use it for all my stakeholders. So I know that, you know, that person will connect back to me or hear my message through LinkedIn. It needs to be formalized, but, you know, not too formalized. I've got to, you know, give them direct links because they're very short on time. So I'm going to do it in 2 sentences. So I think once you have your archetypes and they're about, you know, who are they? How are they hearing the messaging? When would they best hear the messaging? What I want them to know and what do I want them to do? Then bang, you're 50% there or more.
What about you, Isaiah?
Yeah, I was thinking of it, around archetype. I actually forgot what the word was for it. So thank you, Renee. But I think, because we always put in the type of incident, what we're going to say or what we're going to communicate. But we don't think about who we're actually. I was thinking more as who needs to hear the message or who's impacted by these. By this type of whatever it is, the most, because at the moment, you know, we tend to go for the same bell curve approach. You know, as long as we can throw the net out and get as many people as possible, but it's the same net that we used 10 years ago. You know, we haven't thought about actually, are we throwing the net out in the right place? Can we throw another net out at the same time? You know, that's the sort of thing I think misses from I think, you know, I'm trying to think about it from a practical sort of sense to offer something slightly different as well. Is just that, and I'm not too sure if I've ever seen a communication plan consider it or have decent sort of body to it. Is what happens when we do get feedback. You know, I think about the strategic principle. You know, a strategic communication principle. You know, it talks about the aspect of listening. You know, there's a saying that we're born with 2 ears and 1 mouth. You know, and that's, you know, we should be listening, but then we don't incorporate what are we going to do when we do start to hear either feedback, thoughts, or like in any event.
So I use a tool called the context assessment tool, which is an intentional way of doing that, saying, are we being asked the same question multiple times? What exactly are people feeling? Are they, I think it's always really good to know if people are angry or frightened, you know, and often we make a mistake. You'll hear the spokesperson saying, I understand that the community is angry, and they're not angry, they're confused, or he'll say confused, but actually they're frightened. I think getting that information to then, you know, it's not just we've got our plan, we put it out, we're done. It's keeping that cycle going, Isaiah. That really resonated for me. And obviously the idea of context, audience and context will drive us. For me, that's what makes us strategic. Otherwise, we're just saying stuff.
And I think as I mentioned before, or we were talking before about the metrics, like the measurement of communications, and it's like, oh, we got X many hits on our website, or our EDM was opened by X many people. And again, I think that that's the output, and it's the wrong metrics, because as you say, you can cast the net to the same channels, but if they're not actually connecting into the right people, it's kind of worthless. So,
and that connects to what Isaia is saying about let's talk to the impacted people, because I know on socials you can have a massively popular socials page that people in Denmark really think it's hilarious and entertaining, but that's not actually going to help the people in your community. And we need to be a bit braver, I think, about measuring the real impacts and making sure we're getting to the real impacted people. We love to be popular, but we need to also be useful. I have a question for you from the group. Why do TV reporters stand in floodwaters and show visuals of cars driving through the floodwaters when the key safety message is the exact opposite? How do we engage news directors and journos to correct that? That question has been asked around the rooms in EMPA quite a few years. What do you guys think about it? And what do you think we can do about it?
Isaia, do you want to go first?
Does anybody have an answer?
I think we all know why it's done.
Clickbait.
I think, yeah. We all know why. Why, and the multiple images were flashing through my head. Around particularly where you have extreme weather events, and you've got reporters, standing outside, umbrellas turning upside down. They're barely holding on. As
they're prepared to put their lives on the line to get us news. That's the message, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think, I don't know, for me, when you ask a question like that, for me it's around it's that culture shift thing. How do we shift our culture, particularly in terms of news broadcasting, where you still get the same impact, that people understand there's a large event, but we don't have to promote either we don't have to promote things that we don't want people to do, or more particularly, we don't put people's lives in danger. If I was thinking it from a person that was responsible for a reporter, the last thing I want them to do is go stand outside and be swept away by the weather, or be pounded by the weather. Their well-being would be the thing that would resonate. But that's a culture shift to me.
Renee, have you got any ideas about how you can influence?
Yes.
I heard you.
So I started my career working for Channel 9, a TV station. And I was right across the road from the newsroom and a current affair. I was in the comms team. So I was just obsessed by what they did, and, spent days out with reporters and all that sort of stuff. And then it wasn't until I led the national crisis communications for a big fast food chain during swine flu. And I found myself in a food court at 6 o'clock in the morning, unwashed hair, of course, all the TV cameras coming in from the radio stations, wanting footage of, are we closing it, shutting it, whatever. And the journalist, a very respected TV journalist, asked a tradie to go and get a face mask and come in and say it was swine flu. So to come in and say how concerned he was about swine flu. Now, this tradie was just excited that he was going to get his mug on camera, right? So my role was very strategically to make sure the tradie was standing in front of the opposition's fast food shop, so that my fast food client wasn't in the background of the picture. So there's your visual assistance. But I think way back then, I have had a massive issue with the imbalance between sensationalism reporting and actual factual reporting. And I'm now a mum of small kids, and we cannot watch the news. We just do not watch it, because there is no real truth or, real effective storytelling behind it. So way back in the swine flu days, I suggested and thought there needed to be some media standards around disasters that were created, that was like a collaborative agreement between media outlets and, you know, the disaster space. And bearing in mind, this is before social media and all that sort of stuff. So we've obviously got a different environment now. But on the other side of the fence, like I've seen the impacts of small business people who were lost everything in floods or bushfires, who have a camera shoved in their face, wanting them to cry. And if they do or don't react, that is broadcasted to the world with them having no say into it. And it can often have major negative impacts on their small business, which also then impacts their livelihood, their ability to pay their bills and their mental well-being for them and their families. So it has huge consequences. So if there was an interest from EMPA or anyone else about setting up some standards and advocating or lobbying the whole media sector to drive change, count me in. I'm all for that.
One of the things that has happened in EMPA over the last decade or so is that a lot of media organizations, particularly radio, have begun to see themselves as part of the emergency response. So this is, you know, there are memorandums of understanding and there are relationships that are shifting us. Now that is, I think, a lot harder in the broadcast news. You know,
yeah, and I agree. I think like radio,
I think it's doable.
Radio is fundamental, 100%. And I just approved my socials that are coming out in next month, and it's World Radio Day, and we're doing a big promotion around, you know, having a backup radio and you know, radio is essential. And I think it needs to be the education of the broadcasters and the TV reporters on what are the impacts and the consequences of what you say or you show, because again, it goes back to the culture, and maybe it goes back into the university teachings that we have, you know, and the new generation coming up, to understand that there are consequences from what you show. So we're, you know, changing at the top, but also changing the culture. I think.
And this is, I mean, advocating, this is another one of the principles, which is partnering with the media and social media, I might add. And there's a big piece of work to do there. And we'll work on that further in the coming years and decades, I think. I've got a couple more questions for you, and I realize the time is actually running a little short, but that's a good thing. Are strategic leaders always keen to accept measurements of outcomes rather than outputs? I mean, in a way that attributes the outcome to comms rather than the business acumen of the strategic leaders. Simon, interesting question. So outputs are very easy to measure. They're easy for leaders to show that work has been done. How open are they, and how do we make them more open to legitimate measures of outcome and impact?
It's something that for us in the New Zealand context, that particularly any public sector organisation has to really work around. There are a couple of different factors that contribute to why that happens. One, government cycles. You know, for how long respective government is in place, and you know, it is easier. It's a lot easier to look at it from an output perspective. I like looking, you know, like I like to look at it from the perspective that I think there are a number of senior leaders, particularly when I refer back to my own organisation, that are looking more towards trying to understand what outcome measures look like, and I say that's purposefully, looking to understand what outcome measures look like. You know, I think having an outcome, and it does get used a little bit loosely as to what an outcome is, but sorry, going back to my point, I just think that it takes time. You know, if we look at, I'll go back to the Māori perspective because it's easy for me to talk from this space. When they look at outcomes, they're looking at intergenerational outcomes, often things that aren't necessarily measured in their lifetime. So
That's interesting.
bring it back down into a government, into a leadership cycle, things that are measured outside of their time of within a specific organization. We've done some work, for example, on trying to build the organization's cultural capability within Fire and Emergency New Zealand, and we've always taken it from the basis that what we're planting is a seed, and in 10, 12, 25 years time, when people come into our organization, you know, they won't know that that tree that stands in front of them, the big tree that stands in front of them, started off as a seed. You know, that's not something that I will bear fruit from, but if I look at it from a long-term outcome perspective, you know, the people that walk into our organization will know, won't know any different. You know, so I always tell people our role is to be good gardeners. Our role is to look after, nurture the seed, make sure it gets enough water and sunlight. The future generation will bear the fruit from it, but you know, maybe not us. But that's hard to sell, particularly when you're talking about funding proposals, you know, or anything like that.
So we've got to get really good at counting and describing the seeds.
Yeah.
Because, you know, that's what leads to the amazing trees. Love that.
Yeah, and I think, Isaia, it's like you're in my head. Oh my gosh, you're like right there. You know, measuring outcomes is really hard, and I don't know that there is any one, you know, fantastic holistic approach to measuring outpacks. It's a bit measuring outcomes. It's like for us, you know, we're a social enterprise, so we want to measure our impact. So our impact is not necessarily today or tomorrow. Our impact, as Isaia was saying, could be, you know, in 5, 10, you know, years or weeks or whatever to come. But I think, you know, the political cycle has so much to do with outputs versus outcomes. And, you know, you look at like grant funding and it's like, how many did we give and how much money did we give? And, you know, I know in a New South Wales local government area, at one point they had like 72 grants funded. So I know I'm digressing a little bit, but I think it's an important point to say, you know, whoever could say, we gave out 72 projects in this community, but that community didn't need 72 different things. And that community didn't have 72 project managers, I can assure you. So it probably had 4 outcomes that it wanted to get to. And I would argue that those 72 projects didn't actually enable them to get to the outcomes. So I think we need a whole kind of cultural shift that has to be that long term. And yeah, I love the tree and the seed. It's absolutely spot on.
And the fact that you're community centered. I mean, your metrics actually come from what do the community want, rather than what do we want to do. I have 2 questions. I'm looking at the time, but there are 2 quite aligned questions that are about channels, which is, of course, part of the strategic thinking. And one of them says, as a community, we rely too much on electronic messaging at a time at the time of the emergency, rather than promoting planning and preparation prior, particularly in the event of communication methods breaking down. And the other question is, we know that telecommunications can and does break down in disasters. What sort of contingency plans can you build into your planning to get messages through when normal channels are not available? So 2 things. We've been trained into relying on the tools. I remember some sort of leader of one of the fire organisations in Australia actually went on the media and said, please look out your window. That will give you good information, better information than the computer that you have. But we know that sometimes the electronic things go down. What can we set in place?
Going back to the pre-planning, the preparing aspect, I think there's a couple of things, and one's going to build onto the other. Is that making connections is really important. So in a going back to a Māori space, Māori context, a lot of our interactions are done face to face. A lot of them are done face to face. In fact, it's the preferred way of communicating, as opposed to just sending emails. But it's not saying that we don't send emails. It's just when it comes to building connection, building trust, building familiarity, you know, we prefer to do things face to face. Now, the pandemic created a lot of issues for us, so we did have to pivot but the connections that you create before an event, before an emergency, before a disaster, is the spider web that you need of networks that are going to help you communicate when when things start to break down. We call it, actually I don't call it, as somebody down here, I live in Dunedin, she calls it the kumara vine, which is a sweet potato in the vine that sort of runs up and connects to other kumara, using that as a means of communicating. And you know what, during the pandemic as well, we actually had people in the community, particularly around here, Māori community, saying we don't want to hear from another central communicating piece. We want to hear from our people. We want to know what they think, their concerns. We want to know what they're hearing. So yeah, I mean, you know what the challenge is with that is that it takes time. But the opportunity is that you can start today. That's, I mean, it's we're always going to be governed by time. But
and you're right. But networks, if we build the networks now, then you've got 100 communicators at the time of the event. It's not like your little team has to somehow reach out into the whole community. You've got 100 people reaching out into their communities who are reaching out into their communities. It's worth the time, right? Absolutely. Renee, any thoughts on electronic, paper, people? How do we, I think it's another case of layering. We've got to layer. We've got to have all of these things because, some of them are going to fall over.
100%. And it's coming back to your strategic or thoughtful communications around, how do you make sure that someone receives the message? And I think if I can recall back to the good old days of studying, you need to see a message 6 times, I think it is. So what are the 6 kind of ways that you can receive it? And for those of you who know me, I've been collaborating with Professor Daniel Aldrich for like the past 5 years. I'm very grateful to have him volunteering on our advisory group, but also as a delivery partner. So we are driving social capital and social infrastructure change in Australia, and that's all focused on networks. And his research demonstrates that connected communities are more resilient than affluent communities. So you don't necessarily need money to connect, but if you build those connections, and in fact, Professor Aldrich himself would not be here today and his family had it not been for the neighbour next door that knew that he was in a cultural celebration, knocking on his door to interrupt him, to tell him to leave, that he would have been a statistic of Hurricane Katrina. So it is the trusted people in your networks, personally and professionally, that are absolutely critical before, during, and after disasters.
One of the other EMPA principles is about creating networks, and I've seen quite a lot of comments about that. So maybe that should be a future. What are we having now? We're having a webinar. That's what it is. And really dig into how can we build them efficiently, effectively, who is most likely to be willing. That would be a great conversation, I think. Let me know, people, if I'm aligning with your thoughts. I'd like to have a deeper conversation about how to get those networks set up, because it's going to make our lives so much easier on the day that the event hits our communities. Yes to the networking focus of a webinar. I've got at least one person who agrees with me. I am sad to say, my friends, that we have come to the end here. And what I love most is that I think I asked 1 or perhaps 2 of my questions and the rest came from you all. So that sounds like a pretty good conversation to me. I would love you to, send your clapping hands and your love hearts to Isaia and Renee. It has been just such a joy speaking with them. Let me just check on my paperwork to see if there's anything else I need to tell you. There is a recording available. There will be a recording available to everyone via our website in the next few days. And don't forget to check out all the upcoming EMPA events while you're there, including the webinar that I just planned. I hope everybody else thinks it's a good idea. We hope to see you again for the next webinar in February. Thank you so much, Isaia and Renee. It has been an absolute joy and very, very inspiring. I feel like, you know, walking out the door and setting up a network right now. Cheers, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks for having me.
Ka kite.